I'm Marcus Thompson, 29, and after serving 3 brutal tours in Afghanistan as an army medic, I thought the hardest battles were behind me. I was wrong. Last month, my boss at Peterson Associates fired me for not being a team player, all because I refused to falsify safety reports that could have gotten people killed. What she didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting everything for months, including her own violations. The termination letter sitting on my kitchen table right now cites my failure to integrate with team culture. But Linda Peterson had no idea she was dealing with someone trained to save lives under the most extreme conditions. When the Department of Labor investigation I triggered goes public next week, she's going to discover that this veteran knows exactly how to fight battles worth winning. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hit that like button if you've ever had a boss who thought they could intimidate the wrong person. The morning they fired me started like any other Tuesday. I'd arrived at Peterson Associates at 7:30 a.m., coffee in hand, ready to review the safety inspection reports from the Riverside construction project. I had no idea that Linda Peterson had already made her decision to destroy my career. Marcus, can you come to conference room B? The email arrived at 9:15 a.m. from HR. Simple, direct, no explanation. In the military, we learned to read between the lines of communication, and something about the sterile tone made my gut clench. I walked down the hallway past the motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, each one now feeling like a cruel joke. Through the glass walls, I could see Linda Peterson sitting next to Janet from HR, both of them with identical manila folders open in front of them. Professional executioners with their paperwork ready. "Please, have a seat," Janet said, not making eye contact. Linda, on the other hand, stared directly at me with the cold satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this moment. The termination letter was already printed, already signed, already sealed with corporate efficiency. "Marcus," Linda began, her voice carrying that fake concern I'd grown to recognize over the past few months. "We've made the difficult decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke from an IED explosion. I felt that familiar dissociation, the same mental distance I'd experienced during firefights in Kandahar. Time slowed. I could hear the air conditioning humming, could see Linda's perfectly manicured nails drumming against the conference table. "The reason cited is failure to integrate with our team culture," Janet read from her script. "Your inability to collaborate effectively has created workflow disruptions that impact our client relationships." I almost laughed. Team culture. In Afghanistan, I'd carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire. I'd coordinated medical evacuations under mortar attacks. I'd worked seamlessly with units from different branches, different countries, different languages. My military service record, which they'd been so impressed with during hiring, contained commendations specifically for leadership and teamwork under extreme conditions. "This decision is final," Linda added, sliding the termination papers across the table. "Security will escort you to your desk to collect personal items. Your company property, including your laptop, security badge, and vehicle, need to be returned immediately." I picked up the letter, scanning the corporate language that transformed my refusal to endanger lives into failure to align with company objectives. Every word was calculated to protect them legally while destroying me professionally. "I understand," I said quietly, folding the letter and placing it in my jacket pocket. What they didn't understand was that I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. Every conversation recorded on my personal phone, every safety violation photographed and documented, every suspicious payment I'd discovered meticulously cataloged. Linda's smile widened slightly, mistaking my calm for defeat. She had no idea she was looking at someone who'd spent 3 years making life or death decisions under pressure, someone who understood that the real battle was just beginning. As security walked me to my desk, I gathered my few personal items: a photo of my unit from Bagram Airfield, my father's old Zippo lighter, and a small American flag that had flown over our forward operating base. Everything else, the evidence, the documentation, the smoking gun that would bring down her entire corrupt operation, was safely stored at home. Walking out of Peterson and Associates for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving the military, a sense of mission clarity. They thought they'd silenced me. Instead, they'd just declared war on someone who knew how to fight. Sitting in my truck outside Peterson and Associates, I couldn't help but think about the combat medic badge. In my glove compartment, a small piece of metal that represented everything Linda Peterson would never understand about teamwork, sacrifice, and saving lives. Afghanistan taught me things no corporate training seminar ever could. During my first tour in 2018, I was 24 years old and absolutely terrified. The heat, the dust, the constant threat of IEDs and sniper fire, nothing prepares you for that reality. But it was during a Taliban ambush outside Kandahar that I truly learned what being a team player meant. Our convoy had been hit by a roadside bomb. The lead vehicle flipped, trapping 3 soldiers inside while enemy fire rained down from the surrounding hills. While others took cover, I ran toward the burning Humvee, because that's what medics do. We run toward danger when lives are at stake. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Private Chen had a compound fracture in his left leg, bone piercing through his uniform. Corporal Williams was conscious, but trapped under twisted metal, his breathing shallow and rapid. The vehicle could have exploded at any moment, but leaving them wasn't an option. "Thompson, get back here." Lieutenant Harris was screaming orders, trying to coordinate our defensive position, but I was already cutting Rodriguez free from his harness, checking his airway, applying pressure to the bleeding. In those moments, there was no rank, no hierarchy, just human beings depending on each other to survive. I dragged Rodriguez to safety first, then went back for Chen. The enemy fire was getting closer, bullets pinging off the overturned vehicle. My hands were shaking, but my training kicked in. Tourniquet above the fracture, morphine for the pain, stabilize the limb. Williams was next. It took 3 of us to lift the metal, pinning him down. All 3 men survived. All 3 went home, to their families. The combat medic badge they awarded me afterward wasn't just recognition for medical skill. It was acknowledgement that sometimes being a real team player means making decisions that others can't or won't make. My second tour was even harder. More casualties, more impossible decisions, more nights wondering if I'd done enough. But each time someone called Doc across a battlefield, I moved. Each time a wounded soldier needed care under fire, I provided it. That's what teamwork looked like in the real world, not conference room politics or corporate buzzwords, but life and death trust between people who had each other's backs. The third tour nearly broke me. By 2021, I was carrying the weight of every soldier I'd treated, every decision I'd made, every face I couldn't forget. The transition home was brutal. Civilian life felt pointless after spending years where every action had immediate, measurable impact, where every decision literally meant the difference between life and death. That's why I chose construction safety inspection work. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Every violation I caught, every unsafe condition I reported, every accident I prevented, it was a way to keep saving lives without wearing a uniform. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who fired me for not being a team player was asking me to ignore safety violations that could kill innocent workers. In Afghanistan, I'd learned that real leadership sometimes means standing alone when everyone else is wrong. Sometimes being a team player means refusing to go along with decisions that put people at risk. Linda Peterson was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 6 months earlier, Peterson and Associates had seemed like the answer to my prayers. After struggling through a series of dead-end jobs that left me feeling disconnected and purposeless, the opportunity to work in construction safety felt like finding my calling again. The interview process had been thorough and professional. Linda Peterson herself had conducted the final interview, and I'd been genuinely impressed by her apparent commitment to safety and regulatory compliance. She spoke passionately about the company's reputation for thoroughness, their zero policy for cutting corners, and their pride in never having a serious accident on any project they'd inspected. "Marcus," she'd said, leaning forward across her mahogany desk, "your military background is exactly what we need here. The attention to detail, the ability to make tough decisions under pressure, the commitment to protecting others. These are the qualities that separate good safety inspectors from great ones." The hiring contract she'd presented was everything I'd hoped for. Competitive salary, comprehensive benefits, clear advancement opportunities, and most importantly, explicit language about my responsibilities for ensuring workplace safety compliance. Reading through the document that night, I'd felt a surge of excitement I hadn't experienced since leaving the Army. "Our clients trust us to keep their workers safe," Linda had explained during my first day orientation. "Every report you file, every inspection you conduct, every decision you make could be the difference between someone going home to their family or ending up in the hospital. We never compromise on safety. Never." The Peterson Associates offices were impressive, modern building in the downtown business district, state-of-the-art equipment, professional staff who seemed genuinely committed to their work. My cubicle had a view of the city skyline, and I'd set up my workspace with the same precision I'd used for my aid station in Afghanistan. Those first few weeks felt like a honeymoon period. I threw myself into learning the company's procedures, studying local building codes, and familiarizing myself with the various construction projects we oversaw. Linda made a point of introducing me to clients as our new military hire, emphasizing my background and the credibility it brought to their safety assessments. The work itself was engaging and meaningful. I'd arrive at construction sites with my clipboard and measuring tape, systematically checking everything from scaffolding stability to electrical safety protocols. Workers would often approach me with concerns they'd been afraid to voice to their supervisors, and I took pride in being someone they could trust to take their safety seriously. But even in those early days, there were small things that should have raised red flags. Comments from other employees about finding creative solutions to compliance issues. Jokes about clients who were too uptight about regulations. Casual mentions of projects that had been fast-tracked through the approval process. I dismissed these as the kind of workplace grumbling that exists in every organization. Linda's public commitment to safety was so strong, so convincing, that I couldn't imagine the company culture being anything other than what she presented. Looking back, I realize I was so grateful to have found meaningful work again that I ignored warning signs that should have been obvious to someone with my experience reading people and situations. The Peterson Associates I thought I'd joined. The ethical, safety-focused company Linda had described existed only in her sales pitch. The real Peterson Associates, the one that prioritized profits over human lives, was something I'd discover soon enough. And once I did, there would be no going back. The Riverside construction project was supposed to be routine, a mid-rise apartment complex going up on the south side of town, 48 units of affordable housing. The kind of development the city council loved to promote in their press releases about urban renewal. What I found there on that rainy Thursday morning in October would be the first crack in Linda Peterson's carefully constructed facade. I'd arrived at the site at 7 a.m., earlier than usual because I wanted to observe the morning safety briefing. Good construction crews always started the day with a review of hazards and protocols. What I witnessed instead was a foreman barking orders about meeting deadlines while workers scrambled to their positions without any safety discussion whatsoever. The scaffolding caught my attention first. The support brackets were spaced too far apart, according to OSHA standards, and several of the planks showed visible warping from moisture damage. When I climbed up to inspect more closely, I found missing guardrails, improper tie-offs, and anchor points that had been installed into crumbling masonry. "Excuse me?" I called to the foreman, a thick-set man named Bobby Santos, who wore a hard hat covered in Union stickers. "Can you show me the scaffolding inspection records?" Santos looked annoyed at the interruption. "Peterson Associates already signed off on everything last week. We're good to go." That was impossible. I'd been hired 6 weeks ago, and this was my first visit to the Riverside site. No one from our company had conducted a scaffolding inspection here recently. I made a note to check our internal records, but something in Santos's dismissive attitude suggested he wasn't expecting me to follow up. The electrical situation was even worse. Temporary power lines ran across walkways without proper protection. Extension cords snaked through puddles of standing water. The main breaker box had been installed without adequate weatherproofing, and I could see exposed wiring where someone had made hasty connections. "Who's your electrical contractor?" I asked Santos, photographing the violations with my company tablet. "Murphy Electric. They're on the approved vendor list." He was getting more defensive with each question, which in my experience usually meant someone had something to hide. I spent the next 3 hours documenting safety violations throughout the site. Fall protection deficiencies, improper storage of hazardous materials, missing emergency exits, inadequate ventilation in enclosed spaces. By the time I finished, I had identified 23 separate OSHA violations, 7 of which were serious, enough to warrant immediate work stoppage. The drive back to the office gave me time to process what I'd seen. This wasn't just a case of workers being sloppy or a contractor cutting minor corners. The violations were systematic and dangerous, the kind of safety failures that led to serious injuries or deaths, and according to Santos, Peterson and Associates had already approved everything. Linda was in a client meeting when I returned, so I spent the afternoon drafting my inspection report. Each violation was documented with photographs, specific regulatory citations, and recommended corrective actions. The summary was clear. Work at Riverside Construction should cease immediately until all safety deficiencies were addressed. At 4:30, Linda's assistant called me into her office. Linda sat behind her desk with my preliminary report open on her computer screen, her expression unreadable. "Marcus," she began, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard before, sharper, more calculating. "I've reviewed your Riverside assessment, and I think we need to discuss your findings." She turned her monitor so I could see the screen. My detailed report had been reduced to a single paragraph of generic observations, with all specific violations removed. The conclusion now read, "Site conditions meet acceptable safety standards, with minor recommendations for improvement." "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. "The scaffolding alone has multiple serious violations. Workers could be seriously injured or killed." Linda's smile was patient, but cold. "Marcus, you're new to the commercial construction world. Sometimes what looks like a violation to someone with your background is actually standard practice in the industry. Our clients depend on us to be reasonable, to find ways to help them meet their deadlines while maintaining appropriate safety margins." Appropriate safety margins. The phrase hung in the air, like a euphemism for something much darker. "The Riverside project is critically important to the city's housing initiative," she continued. "Delaying construction over minor technical issues would hurt a lot of people who need affordable housing. I'm sure we can find a way to make this work." That's when I realized Linda Peterson wasn't asking me to revise my report. She was ordering me to falsify it, and from her confident tone. This clearly wasn't the first time she'd had this conversation with an employee. The Riverside incident wasn't an isolated case. Over the next 3 weeks, I visited 8 different construction sites, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every project had serious safety violations. Every foreman claimed Peterson and Associates had already provided approval, and every time I tried to file accurate reports, Linda Peterson found reasons to minimize or eliminate my findings. The West Side office complex had scaffolding that violated fall protection standards and electrical systems that should have been condemned. My original report identified 31 separate violations. Linda's revised version mentioned opportunities for minor improvements and concluded that work could continue without interruption. At the Hillcrest Shopping Center renovation, I discovered that load-bearing walls had been removed without proper engineering assessments. The entire structure was at risk of partial collapse. When I recommended immediate evacuation and structural evaluation, Linda called it overly cautious and suggested I was still adjusting to civilian construction standards. But it was the Maple Street residential project that made me realize how deep this corruption ran. While reviewing the site plans in Linda's office, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The electrical contractor listed was Murphy Electric, the same company from Riverside. In fact, looking through the files, Murphy Electric was the electrical contractor for every single project Peterson Associates had approved in the past 6 months. That night, I started building what I came to think of as my investigation file. Using skills I'd learned in military intelligence briefings, I began documenting everything systematically: project names, contractor companies, violation types, approval dates, and most importantly, the financial connections between everyone involved. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Peterson Associates wasn't just rubber stamping dangerous construction practices. They were part of an organized system of corruption that prioritized profits over human lives. Linda Peterson had built her company's reputation on looking the other way, and contractors were paying premium fees for that willful blindness. I found business registration documents showing that Linda had financial interests in several of the construction companies Peterson Associates regularly approved. She wasn't just taking bribes, she was directly profiting from unsafe construction practices. The Riverside project alone would generate over $200,000 in fees for companies she partially owned. But the most damning evidence came from talking to other Peterson Associates employees. During lunch breaks and coffee conversations, I gradually learned that I wasn't the first inspector to raise concerns about safety violations. 3 other inspectors had been fired in the past 2 years for similar failure to integrate with company culture. Sarah Mitchell had lasted only 4 months before being terminated for excessive attention to minor details. She'd tried to halt construction at a hotel project where the fire suppression system was completely inadequate. 2 weeks after her firing, there was a small fire at that hotel. No one died, but 6 people were hospitalized for smoke inhalation. James Rodriguez had been fired for refusing to approve a bridge renovation where the contractor was using substandard materials. The bridge was completed anyway, using Peterson Associates approval from James's replacement. It developed structural cracks within 6 months of opening. Most troubling was the case of Emily Chen, a former Army Corps of Engineers officer who'd been hired with great fanfare about Linda's commitment to veteran employment. Emily had discovered that a high-rise apartment building was being constructed with concrete that didn't meet seismic safety standards. When she refused to approve the foundation work, she was fired for inability to work collaboratively with clients. That building was still under construction. Hundreds of families would eventually live there. Trusting that someone like me had verified it was safe, I realized that Linda Peterson had hired me, not despite my military background, but because of it. My credibility as a veteran gave her approvals more weight with clients and regulatory agencies. She was using my reputation and integrity as cover for her corruption, counting on my respect for authority and chain of command to keep me quiet when I discovered the truth. She had made one critical miscalculation. In the military, I'd learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people willing to stand alone against a corrupt system. And unlike her previous employees, I knew how to fight back. That Friday night, I found myself staring at my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I reached the group chat that had kept me sane since leaving the army. The squad, 6 guys from my unit who'd all made it home and were struggling through their own versions of civilian life. Need some advice from people who get it. I typed, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. Finally, I just called Jake Morrison, my former squad leader who was now working as a police officer in Denver. Thompson, how's the construction gig treating you? Jake's voice carried that familiar mix of authority and warmth that had gotten us through some dark times overseas. That's actually why I'm calling. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining the situation at Peterson Associates, the safety violations, Linda's pressure to falsify reports, and my growing realization that people were going to get hurt or killed if I didn't do something. Jake listened without interrupting, which had always been one of his strengths as a leader. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Sounds like you're dealing with a different kind of ide, he said finally. One that's going to explode whether you touch it or not. Question is, do you want to be the guy who saw it coming and tried to stop it, or the guy who walked away? I know what I should do, I said. It's just ... This job was supposed to be my way back to something meaningful. If I blow this up, I'm probably done in the construction industry. Marcus. Jake's voice got serious, the tone he used to use before dangerous missions. Remember what you told Rodriguez when he was bleeding out in that Humvee? You said I got you, brother. I'm not leaving you behind. Those construction workers are your brothers now. You think any of them signed up to die because some corporate suit wanted to pad her profit margins? That night, I drafted a message to our group chat, carefully avoiding specifics, but outlining the ethical dilemma I was facing. The responses came quickly. Tommy Nugent, who was struggling with PTSD and unemployment. Do what's right, Doc. You always did for us. Carlos Mendez, working as an EMT in Phoenix. Sounds like you already know the answer. Same as when we were getting shot at. Somebody's got to step up. Ryan Kelly, who'd lost his leg to an ide and was now a counselor at the VA. The hardest missions are always the ones where you're standing alone. But that's when it matters most. David Park, who'd become a firefighter. I see what happens when safety gets ignored. Don't let anyone else become a statistic because you stayed quiet. Mike Rodriguez, the same Rodriguez I'd pulled from that burning vehicle, was now a construction foreman in Texas. Been dealing with similar crap down here. Contractors cutting corners, inspectors looking the other way. Lost a good friend last year to a scaffolding collapse that should never have happened. If you've got evidence of this stuff, people need to know. That last message hit hardest. Mike understood both sides, the pressure to keep projects moving and the human cost when safety gets compromised. If he thought I needed to act, then there was no question about what I had to do. The next morning, I started planning my strategy. In Afghanistan, we'd learned that intelligence gathering was the key to successful operations. You had to understand your enemy's capabilities, motivations, and weaknesses before you could defeat them. Linda Peterson had built her operation on secrecy and intimidation, counting on employees being too scared or isolated to fight back. But she hadn't counted on dealing with someone who'd been trained to operate behind enemy lines. Someone with a support network of brothers who'd proven they'd never leave each other behind. The mission parameters were clear. Gather evidence, protect innocent lives, and bring down a corrupt system that was putting people at risk. Time to show Linda Peterson what real teamwork looked like. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Linda made a critical mistake. She'd called me into her office to discuss the final approval for the Riverside project. And in her confidence, she'd left her computer unlocked while stepping out to take a phone call. I had maybe 3 minutes before she returned. My heart was pounding as I opened her email application and quickly scanned the recent messages. What I found there exceeded my worst suspicions about the scope of her corruption. Email after email revealed the intricate web of financial relationships Linda had built. Murphy Electric wasn't just a contractor. They were paying Peterson and Associates a monthly consulting fee of $15,000 that had nothing to do with safety inspections. The payments were disguised as technical advisory services, but the timing corresponded exactly with project approvals. But Murphy Electric was just one piece of the puzzle. Santos Construction, the general contractor for Riverside, was sending monthly payments of $25,000. Westbrook Development was paying $18,000. Hillcrest Properties was contributing $12,000. All told, Linda was collecting over $100,000 per month, in what were essentially bribes for ignoring safety violations. The most damning email was a thread between Linda and City Planning Director Robert Chen, the same last name as Emily Chen, the former Peterson and Associates inspector who'd been fired for refusing to approve substandard concrete. I wondered if they were related, and if Robert's position in city planning had made Emily a threat. The Riverside project needs to move forward on schedule, Robert Chen had written. The mayor's housing initiative depends on these units being available before the election. Any delays over technical issues would be ... problematic. Linda's response was chillingly direct. Understood. My new inspector flagged some minor concerns, but I'm confident we can reach an accommodation that works for everyone. The approval will be issued this week. My hands were shaking as I used my personal phone to photograph the screen. Each email, each payment record, each casual discussion of human lives as acceptable risks for political and financial gain. I was building a case that would destroy not just Linda Peterson, but an entire network of corruption that reached into city government. The financial records showed that Peterson and Associates had approved over $50 million in construction projects in the past year, collecting nearly $1.2 million in bribes, disguised as consulting fees. But the human cost was what really made my blood boil. 3 construction workers had been seriously injured on projects Linda had approved, despite knowing about safety violations. One man, Roberto Vasquez, had fallen 30 feet when scaffolding collapsed at a site where I'd personally documented inadequate fall protection. Roberto had survived, but he'd never walk normally again. His medical bills had bankrupted his family, and Linda Peterson had collected her fee for allowing the conditions that destroyed his life. I heard Linda's heels clicking in the hallway and quickly closed her email application. When she returned to her office, I was sitting calmly in my chair, my expression giving nothing away. "Sorry about that interruption," she said, settling behind her desk. "Now, about the Riverside approval. I understand the pressure you're under," I said carefully. "Political considerations, client relationships, keeping projects moving. But I need you to understand something too." Linda leaned forward, probably thinking she was about to close another deal with another compromised inspector. "The safety violations at Riverside aren't minor technical issues. They're serious hazards that will kill people, and when someone dies, and someone will die if we approve this project, as is both of our names will be on the paperwork that let it happen." Marcus, Linda's voice took on that patronizing tone again. "You're overthinking this. We've been in business for 15 years without a single serious incident. We know how to balance safety with practicality." What she didn't know was that I'd just photographed evidence proving she'd been directly responsible for at least 3 serious incidents, and that her 15 years without incident was built on covering up accidents and paying off victims to stay quiet. "I need some time to review the regulations again," I said, standing to leave. "I want to make sure I'm interpreting everything correctly." "Of course," Linda smiled. "Take all the time you need. But remember, the client is expecting approval by Friday." Walking out of her office, I realized that Linda Peterson had just given me everything I needed to destroy her. The financial records, the email communications, the proof of systematic corruption. It was all there in black and white. She'd been so confident in her control over the situation that she'd gotten careless. That afternoon, I opened a secure, cloud storage account and began uploading everything. If Linda tried to destroy evidence or retaliate against me, copies would be safely stored where she couldn't touch them. The little army medic who wasn't a team player was about to show her what real warfare looked like. That night, I transformed my spare bedroom into a war room. Military intelligence training had taught me that successful operations required meticulous planning and systematic evidence collection. If I was going to bring down Linda Peterson's entire operation, I needed to build an airtight case that could withstand legal scrutiny and media attention. I started by creating an encrypted digital archive of everything I'd discovered: financial records showing the bribery payments, email communications revealing the conspiracy with city officials, safety violation reports that had been falsified or suppressed, photographs of dangerous conditions at construction sites. Each piece of evidence was cataloged with dates, locations, and potential witnesses. The next step was reaching out to the construction workers who'd been injured on Linda's approved projects. This required careful navigation. I couldn't risk alerting Linda to my investigation, but I needed first-hand accounts of the accidents and their consequences. Roberto Vasquez was living in a one-bedroom apartment in the city's east side, barely getting by on disability payments after his scaffolding fall. When I knocked on his door and introduced myself as a safety inspector investigating the accident, his wife Maria answered with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Are you here to help, or are you here to make more problems for us?" she asked, in accented English. I spent an hour with Roberto and Maria, listening to their story and documenting the physical and financial devastation the accident had caused. Roberto showed me the medical reports detailing his shattered vertebrae and permanent nerve damage. Maria showed me the bills that had consumed their life savings and forced them to sell their house. The lawyer said we couldn't sue because the safety inspection was approved. Roberto told me, his voice filled with quiet bitterness. He said everything was legal, everything was done right. But I know what I saw. The scaffolding wasn't safe. I told the foreman, but he said the inspector had signed off on everything. I carefully explained that I was investigating potential misconduct in the inspection process, and that their case might be part of a larger pattern. Roberto's eyes widened when I showed him photographs of the current conditions at Riverside. The same inadequate scaffolding, the same missing safety equipment, the same criminal negligence that had destroyed his life. "You're saying this is still happening?" Maria's voice was incredulous. "Other families are going to go through what we went through." That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for abstract principles of safety and integrity. I was fighting for Roberto and Maria, for the families who would be destroyed if Linda's corruption continued, for the workers who trusted that someone like me was protecting them. Over the next 2 weeks, I documented everything with the systematic thoroughness I'd learned in Afghanistan. I recorded conversations with Linda using my personal phone, being careful to stay within legal boundaries while capturing her admissions about flexibility and safety standards. I photographed financial documents during late-night visits to the office when I was supposedly working overtime. I even followed the money trail, discovering offshore accounts and shell companies that Linda used to hide her bribery income. The picture that emerged was staggering in its scope. Peterson Associates wasn't just compromising safety inspections. They were the linchpin in a corruption network that included city officials, construction companies, and even some regulatory agencies. Linda had been taking bribes for so long that she'd gotten comfortable, arrogant, almost casual about the human lives she was putting at risk for profit. But building the case was taking a personal toll. I was living a double life, pretending to be a loyal employee while secretly gathering evidence to destroy my boss. The stress was affecting my sleep, my appetite, my relationships. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, wondering if Linda suspected anything, planning what I'd do if she discovered my investigation. The breakthrough came when I gained access to Linda's personal bank records through a combination of social engineering and her predictably weak password security. The financial trail was clear and undeniable. Systematic payments from construction companies, corresponding exactly with safety approvals, routed through multiple accounts to obscure the money laundering. I had enough evidence to bring down Linda Peterson and everyone connected to her operation. The question was no longer whether I could prove the corruption, but whether I had the courage to trigger the explosion that would destroy everything. The moment of truth came on a gray Thursday morning in November. Linda had scheduled a meeting to discuss the final approval for the Riverside project, and I knew this would be my last chance to try reasoning with her before taking more drastic action. Her office felt different that morning, smaller, more oppressive. The motivational posters and corporate awards that had once impressed me now looked like props in an elaborate deception. Linda sat behind her desk with the falsified Riverside report open on her computer, ready for my signature. "Marcus, I'm glad we can finally put this project to bed," she said with that practiced smile. "I know you've had some concerns, but I think you'll see that our revised assessment addresses all the regulatory requirements while keeping the project on schedule." I looked at the document on her screen. My original findings had been completely rewritten. The dangerous scaffolding was now described as adequate with minor adjustments recommended. The faulty electrical work was characterized as meeting industry standards with routine maintenance needed. Most egregiously, the missing fall protection equipment was simply not mentioned at all. "Linda, I can't sign this report." The words came out calmly, but I could feel my heart pounding. "The conditions at Riverside are going to get someone killed." "Her?" Smile faltered slightly. "Marcus, we've discussed this. You're still adjusting to the realities of commercial construction. These kinds of technical interpretations require experience and flexibility." "I have experience," I said. 3 years of making decisions where people's lives depended on getting it right. And I know the difference between flexibility and negligence." Linda's expression hardened. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, studying me like a predator evaluating prey. "Let me be very clear about something," she said, her voice losing all pretense of warmth. "Peterson Associates has built its reputation on being reasonable, on working with clients to find solutions that balance safety with practicality. That's why we're successful, and that's why our employees have job security." She paused, letting the implied threat sink in. "Other inspectors have struggled with this concept." Sarah Mitchell thought she knew better than 15 years of industry experience. James Rodriguez believed his rigid interpretation of regulations was more important than collaborative problem-solving. Emily Chen couldn't adapt her military mindset to civilian realities. Hearing Emily's name confirmed what I'd suspected. Linda was making this personal, using our shared military background as a weapon against me. "All 3 of them found other employment," Linda continued, "though I understand their references from Peterson and Associates weren't particularly helpful in their job searches. The construction industry is smaller than you might think, Marcus. People talk. Reputations matter." The threat was clear: sign the falsified report or face professional blackmail that would destroy my career. Linda was betting that my need for employment would overcome my conscience, just like it had with previous inspectors she'd corrupted or intimidated. "I understand the position you're putting me in," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand mine. The scaffolding at Riverside violates OSHA fall protection standards by at least 6 different criteria. The electrical work includes exposed live wires and wet conditions. The emergency egress routes are blocked by construction materials." I leaned forward, making direct eye contact. "If someone dies on that job site, and my signature is on the approval paperwork, I'll be legally liable. More importantly, I'll have to live with knowing I could have prevented it." Linda's face showed a flash of genuine anger before she regained control. "Marcus, you're being naive. Construction work has inherent risks. Accidents happen despite everyone's best efforts. What matters is having proper documentation, showing that reasonable professionals followed established procedures." She was asking me to provide legal cover for negligence that would likely kill someone. The falsified safety report wasn't just corruption. It was premeditated manslaughter disguised as paperwork. I can't do this, Linda. I won't sign a report that I know is false. The silence stretched between us for long seconds. When Linda finally spoke, her voice was cold and final. Then I'm afraid you're not the right fit for Peterson Associates after all. The official termination meeting happened the next morning, but it felt like a formality. Linda had already made her decision the moment I refused to sign the falsified Riverside report. Now she just needed to execute the bureaucratic theater that would protect her legally while destroying me professionally. I arrived at the office knowing it would be my last day, but I wasn't prepared for the calculated cruelty of how Linda orchestrated my dismissal. She'd scheduled the meeting for 9 a.m., ensuring that other employees would witness my walk of shame. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who don't play along. Conference room B felt like a tribunal. Linda sat with Janet from HR, and a man I didn't recognize, introduced as legal counsel. All of them with matching manila folders and practiced expressions of corporate concern. The security guard standing by the door wasn't subtle about his purpose. Marcus, Linda began, reading from a prepared script. After careful review of your performance and integration with our team culture, we've made the difficult decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Janet slid the termination paperwork across the table. The language was precise and damaging. Failure to integrate with team culture, inability to collaborate effectively with clients, rigid interpretation of procedures that impacted project efficiency. Every phrase was calculated to make me unemployable in the construction industry, but it was the legal counsel who delivered the real message. Mr. Thompson, as part of your employment agreement, you signed a non-disclosure clause regarding proprietary company methods and client relationships. We trust you understand the serious legal implications of violating that agreement. They were warning me to stay quiet about what I'd discovered, threatening legal action if I spoke out about the corruption. Linda sat back with a satisfied smile, clearly believing she'd neutralized the threat I represented. I understand, I said quietly, signing the termination papers. What they didn't understand was that I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, building a case that would survive any legal challenges they might throw at me. The security escort to my desk was humiliating by design. Other employees watched as I packed my personal items into a cardboard box, the photo of my army unit, my father's Zippo lighter, the small American flag from Afghanistan. Everything else belonged to Peterson Associates, including the laptop that contained evidence of Linda's corruption. But Linda had made a crucial mistake. She assumed that, like her previous victims, I would slink away quietly, broken and intimidated. She didn't realize that my real evidence was stored safely at home, that my investigation had moved far beyond anything she could control or destroy. Your company credit cards, building access badge, and vehicle keys, the security guard said, checking items off a list. Each surrender felt symbolic. They were stripping away the professional identity I'd worked so hard to rebuild after leaving the military. Walking out of Peterson Associates for the last time, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that I no longer had to pretend loyalty to Linda's corrupt operation. Anger at the injustice of being punished for refusing to compromise my integrity. But mostly, I felt a cold determination that had sustained me through the worst fight. In Afghanistan, Linda Peterson thought she'd won. She'd eliminated another troublesome inspector and protected her profitable corruption network. In her mind, I was just another broken veteran who couldn't adapt to civilian realities, another casualty of her ruthless business practices. She had no idea that terminating me was the biggest tactical error she could have made. As long as I was her employee, I was constrained by company policies and legal obligations. Now, I was free to act without restrictions, free to share everything I'd discovered with people who had the power to bring her down. That afternoon, I sat in my truck outside the Peterson Associates building, looking up at Linda's corner office windows. She was probably celebrating, thinking she'd successfully silenced another threat. But in the military, we'd learned that sometimes the most devastating attacks came from directions the enemy never expected. Linda Peterson was about to discover that firing Marcus Thompson hadn't eliminated her problem. It had just turned a constrained internal investigation into an all-out war, where I had nothing left to lose and every reason to fight. The first call I made after leaving Peterson Associates was to the Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I'd researched the process weeks earlier, knowing this moment would come. OSHA had specific protections for whistleblowers who reported safety violations, and retaliation against employees who refused to participate in unsafe practices was a federal crime. OSHA complaint hotline. This is Jennifer. How can I help you? I need to file a complaint about workplace safety violations and retaliation against a whistleblower, I said, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was about to set in motion. I can connect you with one of our investigators. Can you? Hold for a moment. Those few minutes on hold felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that once I jumped, there would be no going back. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built since leaving the military, was about to be destroyed or vindicated based on the evidence I'd collected. This is Investigator Sarah Chen, a voice said when the call connected. I understand you want to file a safety complaint. I spent the next hour walking Sarah through everything I'd discovered. The systematic safety violations at multiple construction sites, the falsified inspection reports, the financial payments from contractors to Peterson Associates, the pattern of firing inspectors who refused to compromise their integrity, the retaliation I'd faced for refusing to approve dangerous conditions. Sarah's questions were thorough and professional. She understood the technical aspects of construction safety, the legal requirements for proper inspections, and the serious implications of what I was reporting. Most importantly, she recognized that the evidence I'd gathered could expose corruption. That went far beyond a single company. Mr. Thompson, she said when I finished my account, what you're describing represents multiple federal violations: safety fraud, bribery, retaliation against whistleblowers, and conspiracy to endanger workers. If your evidence supports these allegations, this could be one of the largest construction safety cases we've handled. The next step was meeting with a lawyer. Jake Morrison had connected me with David Park's cousin, an attorney named Lisa Park, who specialized in whistleblower protection and employment law. Her office was in a modest building downtown, but her reputation for taking on corporate corruption was formidable. Marcus, Lisa said after reviewing the initial evidence I'd brought, you've documented a textbook case of systematic safety fraud. The financial records alone show clear patterns of bribery. The falsified reports demonstrate deliberate endangerment of workers. Your termination for refusing to participate provides the retaliation angle. She leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. But I need you to understand what you're getting into. Linda Peterson has resources, connections, and a lot to lose. She's going to fight this with everything she has. The process could take years. Your name will be public. Your employment prospects in construction could be destroyed even if we win. I understand the risks, I said. But I also understand what happens if I don't act. Roberto Vasquez is paralyzed because Linda approved unsafe scaffolding. How many more workers need to be injured or killed before someone stands up to this? Lisa smiled grimly. That's exactly the kind of motivation that wins these cases. When it's about more than money or revenge. When it's about protecting people who can't protect themselves, juries pay attention. We spent the next 3 hours developing our strategy. Lisa would handle the legal aspects, filing formal complaints with OSHA, the Department of Labor, and the State Attorney General's office. I would continue documenting evidence and identifying potential witnesses. Among construction workers and other former Peterson Associates employees, the plan was methodical and comprehensive. We would attack Linda's operation from multiple directions. Simultaneously, federal safety violations, state bribery charges, civil lawsuits from injured workers, and media exposure that would destroy her company's reputation. By the time we were finished, Peterson Associates would be radioactive in the construction industry. But the most important element of our strategy was timing. Linda thought she'd neutralized me by firing me quickly and threatening legal action. She was probably assuming I'd slink away quietly, like her previous victims. Instead, we were going to move fast and hit hard before she realized the full scope of the threat she was facing. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the Department of Labor complaint form in front of me, ready to sign the document that would trigger a federal investigation. My hand hesitated for just a moment, knowing that signing meant there was no going back. Then I thought about Roberto Vasquez in his wheelchair, about the families who would be devastated if another worker was killed by Linda's negligence, about the oath I'd taken as a medic to first do no harm. Sometimes protecting people meant destroying the systems that threatened them. I signed the complaint and prepared to go to war. The Department of Labor moved faster than I'd expected. Within 48 hours of filing my complaint, investigator Sarah Chen called to schedule my formal interview. Within a week, federal investigators were knocking on Peterson Associates' door with subpoenas and search warrants. I wasn't there to see Linda's face when the investigators arrived, but I heard about it from Jennifer Walsh, a junior inspector, who'd always been friendly during my time at the company. She called me that evening, her voice excited and nervous. "Marcus, you should have seen it. 3 investigators in suits, flashing badges, and demanding access to all the company records. Linda went completely white when they mentioned your name and started asking about safety report modifications. The federal investigation notice that Jennifer described was everything I'd hoped for. OSHA was conducting a comprehensive audit of Peterson Associates' safety practices, with particular focus on the projects I'd identified. Every inspection report would be reviewed. Every financial transaction would be scrutinized. Every employee would be interviewed under oath. But the real breakthrough came when other employees started coming forward. Jennifer Walsh was the first, admitting that she'd been pressured to overlook safety violations on multiple projects. Then came Michael Roberts, a senior inspector who'd been with the company for 8 years, revealing that the corruption went back much further than I'd realized. It started small, Michael told the investigators during his interview, which I learned about through Lisa Park's legal channels. Maybe overlooking a minor electrical issue here, approving scaffolding that was almost up to standard there. But Linda kept pushing for more flexibility, more accommodation of client needs. Before we knew it, we were routinely approving projects that we knew were dangerous. The most damaging testimony came from former employees who'd been fired or forced out for refusing to participate in the corruption. Sarah Mitchell, the inspector who'd been terminated for trying to halt construction at the hotel with inadequate fire suppression, provided documentation of safety violations that had been covered up years before I arrived at the company. Emily Chen, the former Army Corps of Engineers officer, revealed that her firing hadn't just been about the concrete standards issue. She'd discovered that Linda was taking kickbacks from multiple contractors and had threatened to expose the entire operation before being silenced through termination and legal threats. Linda Peterson told me that my military background made me too rigid for civilian construction work. Emily testified. She said I needed to learn the difference between theoretical safety standards and practical business realities. When I refused to compromise on issues that could endanger lives, she destroyed my career and made sure I couldn't find work anywhere in the industry. The pattern was clear and consistent. Linda had built her business model on systematic corruption, using intimidation and professional blackmail to silence anyone who threatened her profitable arrangement with construction contractors. My case wasn't isolated. It was just the latest example of a predatory system that had been operating for years. But what really accelerated the investigation was the media attention. Local news reporter Amanda Rodriguez had been covering construction safety issues for years, and when she learned about the federal investigation into Peterson and Associates, she recognized the significance of the story. "This isn't just about one corrupt company," Amanda told me during our first interview. "This is about a systematic failure of safety oversight that's put countless workers at risk. The public needs to know how their building safety inspections have been compromised." The television coverage was devastating for Linda's operation. Construction workers calling in with stories about unsafe conditions that had been approved by Peterson and Associates. City council members demanding answers about the approval process for public projects. Contractors distancing themselves from Linda's company as the corruption became public knowledge. Within 2 weeks of the federal investigation launch, Peterson and Associates had lost major clients, faced multiple civil lawsuits, and become the subject of a criminal investigation by the state attorney general's office. Linda Peterson's carefully constructed empire was crumbling, and everyone could see that this was just the beginning. The veteran they'd dismissed as not a team player had just shown them what real accountability looked like. The local news investigation that Amanda Rodriguez launched became a media firestorm that consumed Peterson and Associates and everyone connected to Linda's corruption network. Her report, titled "Built on Lies: How Safety Inspections Were Sold to the Highest Bidder," aired on a Thursday evening and immediately went viral on social media. The report featured devastating footage of the construction sites I'd documented, with clear visual evidence of the safety violations Linda had approved. Roberto Vasquez appeared on camera from his wheelchair, describing how the scaffolding collapse had destroyed his life while Peterson and Associates collected fees for approving the dangerous conditions that caused his injury. But it was the financial evidence that really captured public attention. Amanda's investigation team had obtained records showing that Linda Peterson was living far beyond what her legitimate business income could support. The $2.3 million house in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, the luxury cars, the offshore investment accounts, all funded by bribes for ignoring safety violations that put working people at risk. Linda Peterson built her wealth on the broken bodies of construction workers, Amanda reported. While families like the Vasquez family lost everything to medical bills and disability, Peterson was depositing contractor kickbacks into accounts in the Cayman Islands. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Construction workers organized protests outside Peterson and Associates offices. Labor unions demanded criminal prosecutions. City council members who had praised Linda's company in the past suddenly discovered urgent schedule conflicts when reporters called for comment. But the most significant development was the expansion of the criminal investigation. State Attorney General Maria Santos announced that her office was launching a comprehensive probe into corruption in the construction industry, with Peterson and Associates as the primary focus. The evidence suggests a pattern of systematic bribery, safety fraud, and conspiracy to endanger workers that may involve dozens of construction companies and potentially corrupt city officials. Attorney General Santos announced at a press conference, "We will pursue criminal charges against everyone involved in this conspiracy, regardless of their position or connections." That announcement sent shockwaves through the construction industry and city government. Contractors who had paid bribes to Linda Peterson suddenly found themselves facing potential criminal liability. City officials who had fast-tracked approvals for Peterson and Associates projects were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Robert Chen, the city planning director who'd exchanged emails with Linda about expediting the Riverside project approval, announced his immediate resignation to focus on personal matters. His departure triggered additional investigations into permit approvals and zoning decisions that had benefited Linda's clients. Murphy Electric, the contractor that had been paying Linda $15,000 per month in consulting fees, declared bankruptcy. Within 2 weeks of the story breaking, Santos Construction, Westbrook Development, and Hillcrest Properties all suspended operations, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The Riverside construction project, that had started this entire chain of events was shut down by emergency order from the city. Independent safety inspectors found even more violations than I'd originally documented, including structural defects that could have caused the entire building to collapse during the first major storm. If Mr. Thompson hadn't refused to approve this project, we could have been looking at dozens of deaths when the building failed, the independent inspector told reporters. The courage he showed in standing up to corruption literally saved lives. But Linda Peterson wasn't going down without a fight. Her high-priced legal team launched a counterattack, claiming that I was a disgruntled employee fabricating evidence to get revenge for being fired. They filed defamation lawsuits against me, Amanda Rodriguez, and several media outlets. They hired a public relations firm to spread stories about my instability and inability to adapt to civilian employment. The personal attacks were vicious and coordinated. Anonymous sources claimed I'd been problematic during my military service. Former Peterson Associates employees who still worked for Linda spread rumors about my mental health and professional competence. Online trolls flooded social media with character assassination attempts designed to discredit my testimony. For a few weeks, the narrative war was genuinely concerning. Linda's resources and connections were formidable, and she was using every tool at her disposal to destroy my credibility and escape accountability. But she'd made one fatal miscalculation. The evidence I'd gathered wasn't based on my word against hers. It was based on documents, photographs, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses. No amount of character assassination could change the fact that she'd taken bribes to approve dangerous construction projects that injured and killed workers. When the grand jury handed down the indictments, Linda Peterson's world finally collapsed. Completely. The grand jury indictments came down on a cold Tuesday morning in February, exactly 4 months after Linda Peterson had fired me for not being a team player. Watching the news coverage from my living room, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness as federal marshals led Linda away in handcuffs. The charges were extensive and damning. 15 counts of bribery, 23 counts of safety fraud, 7 counts of conspiracy to endanger workers, 4 counts of money laundering. The prosecutors had built a case that could put Linda Peterson in federal prison for the rest of her life. But Linda wasn't the only one facing justice. The corruption network she'd built involved dozens of people who'd profited from putting workers' lives at risk. Murphy Electric's owner, Thomas Murphy, was charged with bribery and conspiracy. Santos Construction's Bobby Santos faced similar charges. Even Robert Chen, the former city planning director, was indicted for his role in expediting dangerous project approvals. The Peterson Associates bankruptcy filing came the same day as the indictments. Years of legal fees, civil lawsuits, and lost contracts had drained the company's resources. The business Linda had built on corruption and intimidation was officially dead. Lisa Park called me that afternoon with an update on the civil litigation front. "Marcus, the settlement offers are pouring in. Every contractor who paid bribes to Linda is trying to avoid going to trial. The Vasquez family alone could receive over $2 million in compensation for Roberto's injuries." That news meant everything to me. Roberto and Maria had suffered for years because of Linda's corruption, watching their savings disappear into medical bills, while the people responsible for the accident continued profiting from similar negligence. Now they would finally have the resources to rebuild their lives and provide for their children's futures. But the most satisfying development was the wave of safety improvements sweeping through the construction industry. Companies that had relied on Peterson Associates' corrupt approvals were now hiring legitimate safety inspectors. Contractors were voluntarily upgrading their safety protocols to avoid association with the scandal. Workers were speaking up about unsafe conditions without fear of retaliation. "Your case has fundamentally changed how safety inspections work in this city," Amanda Rodriguez told me during a follow-up interview. "Companies know that workers and inspectors won't stay silent about corruption anymore. The cost of cutting corners just became too high. The professional vindication was equally important. Construction companies that had initially avoided hiring me because of Linda's character assassination campaign were now reaching out with job offers. My reputation as the inspector who'd refused to compromise safety for profit had become a valuable credential in an industry desperate to rebuild public trust. 3 former Peterson Associates employees reached out to apologize for their silence during my time at the company. Jennifer Walsh was particularly emotional during our phone call. "I knew what Linda was doing was wrong," she said, "but I was scared of losing my job, scared of being blacklisted like the other inspectors who'd stood up to her. When you refused to sign that Riverside report, I admired your courage, but I was too cowardly to support you. I'm sorry it took federal investigators showing up for me to finally tell the truth." I understood her position better than she realized. The military had taught me about the courage required to stand alone against corrupt authority, but civilian employees didn't have that training or mindset. Linda Peterson had built her system specifically to exploit people's fear and economic vulnerability. The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. I was invited to speak at safety conferences about the importance of integrity in construction inspections. Labor unions asked me to train workers on how to report safety violations without facing retaliation. Law schools wanted me to discuss whistleblower protection with their students. Most importantly, Roberto called to thank me personally for exposing the corruption that had destroyed his life. "My injury can't be undone," he said, "but at least now other families won't go through what we went through. You gave my suffering meaning by making sure it wouldn't happen to others." As I watched the news coverage of Linda Peterson's arraignment, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the battlefields of Afghanistan to a corrupt construction company, to a federal courthouse where justice was finally being served. Every step had prepared me for the moment when I had to choose between personal security and protecting innocent lives. Linda Peterson had made the mistake of thinking that calling me not a team player was an insult. She never understood that sometimes being a real team player means standing up to the people who are hurting your team. 6 months after Linda Peterson's conviction, I stood in the small office space I'd rented downtown, hanging my new business license on the wall. Thompson Safety Consulting. Integrity first. Read the simple black letters on white background. It wasn't fancy, but it represented everything I'd fought for. Starting my own safety consulting firm had been Jake Morrison's idea during one of our regular check-ins. "You've got the credibility now," he'd said. "Every construction company in the city knows you're the guy who can't be bought. That's worth more than any marketing campaign." The first few months were challenging. Building a client base from scratch, establishing systems and procedures, learning the business side of running a company. But word spread quickly through the construction industry that Thompson Safety Consulting meant honest, thorough inspections that companies could trust and workers could rely on. My first major client was Riverside Development, the same company that had been trying to build the apartment complex where this entire saga began. After the corruption scandal, they'd hired new contractors and wanted completely independent safety oversight to rebuild their reputation. Marcus, their project manager Sarah Kim, told me during our initial meeting, "We need someone who'll tell us the truth about safety conditions, even if it's not what we want to hear." The Peterson Associates scandal taught us that cutting corners costs more in the long run than doing things right the first time. The Riverside project became a showcase for how construction safety should work. Every scaffold was properly installed and inspected. Every electrical connection met or exceeded code requirements. Every worker had proper fall protection equipment. The project took 3 months longer than originally scheduled, but there were 0 accidents and 0 safety violations. But building a successful business was only part of what I wanted to accomplish. The Peterson Associates case had shown me that the construction industry needed systematic change, not just better individual inspectors. I started developing training programs for safety inspectors, focusing on recognizing and resisting corruption pressure. The veteran angle became a natural specialization. Military personnel transitioning to civilian careers often struggled with the ethical compromises expected in corporate environments. I began recruiting other veterans who shared my commitment to integrity over profit. Tommy Nguyen was my first hire, the same Tommy who'd encouraged me to do what's right when I'd reached out to our veteran group chat for advice. His PTSD had made traditional employment difficult, but his attention to detail and unwillingness to compromise on safety made him an excellent inspector. This is the first job I've had since leaving the Army where I feel like I'm making a difference. Again, Tommy told me after his first month, knowing that my work is actually protecting people, not just generating paperwork for some corporation, it makes everything worthwhile. Carlos Mendez joined next, bringing his EMT experience and deep understanding of how construction accidents affected families. David Park referred his friend Mike Chen, a former Navy CB who understood both construction techniques and military standards of integrity. Within a year, Thompson Safety Consulting had grown into a team of 8 veteran inspectors, all committed to the principle that workers' safety was non-negotiable. We developed a reputation for thoroughness that made contractors nervous, but gave workers confidence that someone was truly looking out for their welfare. The financial success surprised me. Companies were willing to pay premium rates for inspections they could trust completely. Insurance companies started offering discounts to contractors who used our services. Labor unions recommended us to their members as inspectors who would prioritize worker safety over client relationships. But the real validation came from the workers themselves. Construction crews would approach our inspectors with safety concerns they'd been afraid to voice to company-employed inspectors. Knowing that we had no financial incentive to overlook violations, workers trusted us to address problems that could save their lives. "You guys are different," a crane operator named James Rodriguez told me during an inspection. "Other inspectors, you never know if they're working for the company or working for safety. With you, we know you're working for us." The business license hanging on my office wall represented more than just a successful company. It was proof that integrity could be profitable, that doing the right thing didn't have to mean professional suicide, and that the skills I'd learned in military service could protect people in civilian life. Linda Peterson had fired me for not being a team player. Now I was leading a team dedicated to protecting the lives she'd been willing to sacrifice for profit. 2 years after exposing Linda Peterson's corruption network, I found myself standing at a podium in the Chicago Convention Center, addressing over 500 construction safety professionals at the National Safety Conference. The speaking engagement program I'd developed had become one of the most requested presentations in the industry. Safety inspections aren't just about following regulations, I told the audience, looking out at faces representing companies from across the country. They're about the promise we make to workers, that someone is looking out for their welfare, that someone values their lives more than project schedules or profit margins. The presentation included the Peterson Associates case study, but I'd learned to focus on the broader lessons rather than the specific details of corruption. Construction safety was improving industry-wide, partly because the scandal had shown companies the real cost of cutting corners, but mostly because workers were no longer willing to accept dangerous conditions in silence. The questions after my presentation were always revealing. Young inspectors wanted to know how to handle pressure from supervisors to overlook violations. Experienced professionals shared their own stories of corruption and retaliation. Company executives asked for guidance on building safety cultures that couldn't be compromised by financial pressures. But the most meaningful conversations happened during breaks, when people approached me privately to share their personal experiences. A safety inspector from Texas who'd been fired for refusing to approve inadequate scaffolding. A construction worker from Florida whose brother had been killed in an accident that proper inspection might have prevented. A company owner who'd realized that his pressure on inspectors to be flexible had nearly led to tragedy. Your story gave me the courage to speak up when I saw violations. A young woman named Amanda Stevens told me after one presentation. I kept thinking about what you said, that sometimes being a team player means protecting your team from the people who are supposed to lead them. The mentoring work with other veterans facing workplace challenges had become equally important. Veterans Affairs had started referring transitioning service members to me when they struggled with ethical conflicts in civilian employment. The military's emphasis on integrity and mission accomplishment often clashed with corporate expectations about flexibility and accommodation. The skills you learned in the military, attention to detail, unwillingness to compromise on safety, loyalty to the people depending on you, those aren't weaknesses in civilian life. I would tell these veterans, they're exactly what the construction industry needs, even if some companies don't realize it yet. The veteran support network that had sustained me during my own crisis had grown into a formal organization. Veterans for Workplace Integrity provided resources for service members facing ethical dilemmas, legal support for those experiencing retaliation, and job placement assistance for veterans who'd been blacklisted for refusing to compromise their principles. Jake Morrison had taken over day-to-day operations of the organization, using his police background to help veterans navigate legal challenges. Tommy Nguyen ran the job placement program, connecting ethical veterans with companies that valued integrity over compliance. Carlos Mendez developed training programs for recognizing and reporting workplace corruption. The personal growth from trauma to purpose had been unexpected. The Peterson Associates scandal had nearly destroyed my career and put enormous stress on my relationships and mental health. But fighting that battle had given me a clarity of purpose I'd been missing since leaving the military. Sometimes, the worst things that happen to us reveal who we really are, I told audiences during my presentations. Linda Peterson thought she was punishing me by firing me for not being a team player. Actually, she was freeing me to build something better than anything I could have accomplished working for her. The construction industry still faced challenges with safety and corruption, but the landscape had fundamentally changed. Workers knew they had advocates who couldn't be bought. Companies understood that the cost of accidents far exceeded the cost of proper safety measures. Inspectors had examples of people who'd stood up to corruption and not only survived, but thrived. Building something meaningful from betrayal had taught me that integrity wasn't just about personal character. It was about creating systems and communities that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 years after Linda Peterson had fired me from Peterson Associates. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting on the envelope was careful and deliberate, suggesting someone who didn't write letters often. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that brought tears to my eyes. Mr. Thompson, you don't know me, but my husband Carlos worked construction for 23 years before he died in a scaffolding accident last month. The insurance company tried to say it was his fault, but the investigation showed that the safety inspection had been falsified. Because of your case against Peterson Associates, there are now laws protecting workers like Carlos. The company responsible has been shut down, and the people who approved the unsafe conditions are facing criminal charges. My husband's death wasn't prevented, but your courage made sure that the people responsible couldn't hurt other families. Thank you for fighting for people like us. Maria Gonzalez. I sat in my office for a long time after reading that letter, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the battlefields of Afghanistan, where I'd learned that sometimes you have to run toward danger to save lives, to a corporate office where I'd discovered that courage sometimes meant standing alone against corruption, to building a company and movement dedicated to protecting the people who built our cities and communities. The construction accident that had been prevented by the Peterson Associates investigation was never recorded in any official statistics. There was no news coverage of the buildings that didn't collapse, the workers who didn't fall, the families who didn't lose their breadwinners. because proper safety inspections had identified and corrected dangerous conditions, but I knew they existed. Every project that Thompson Safety Consulting inspected properly. Every violation we caught before it caused an accident. Every worker who went home safely because someone had valued their life more than a construction schedule. Roberto Vasquez had used his settlement money to start a non-profit organization advocating for construction workers' safety. He'd invited me to serve on the board, bringing the perspective of someone who understood both the technical and political aspects of safety enforcement. Marcus, he'd told me during our last board meeting, what happened to me was terrible, but it had meaning because you made sure it wouldn't happen to others. Sometimes bad things happen so that good people have a chance to stand up and make things better. Linda Peterson had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $5.2 million in restitution to workers injured on projects she'd corruptly approved. The last I'd heard, she was serving her time in a minimum security facility, probably still convinced that she'd been unfairly persecuted for standard business practices. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd called me not a team player for refusing to endanger lives for profit, but real teamwork meant protecting the people depending on you, even when the people in authority told you to abandon them. My military training had prepared me for this civilian battle in ways I'd never expected. The decision-making under pressure, the willingness to accept personal risk for a greater mission, the understanding that some fights are worth having even when you're outnumbered and outgunned, as filed at Maria Gonzalez's letter and placed it in the file where I kept similar messages from families whose lives had been affected by the case. I realized that this story would never really end. There would always be people like Linda Peterson who prioritized profit over human lives. There would always be workers whose safety depended on inspectors having the courage to do their jobs honestly. But there would also always be people willing to fight for what's right, willing to stand up to corruption even when it cost them everything, willing to run toward danger to protect others. 3 years ago, Linda Peterson had fired me for not being a team player. Today, I was leading a team dedicated to the principle that every worker deserved to go home safe to their family. Sometimes the best revenge is proving that integrity isn't just morally right, it's the foundation for building something better than anything your enemies could imagine. If you've ever faced a choice between doing what's right and doing what's easy, I hope this story gives you the courage to choose integrity. Share your own workplace integrity stories in the comments below, because every voice matters when we're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves.